chapters 1 to 4, and we will not have time over the next 9 weeks as we're walking through Exodus to really hit every single word, every single verse. And so rather than kind of using the imagery of boots on the ground, we're going to take a walk through the book of Exodus. We're not going to do that, nor are we going to be at 30,000 feet and try to just zoom by in one sermon. So in 9 weeks, we're going to walk through this. And so with that, I would encourage you to grab one of these sheets and spend time each week reading through the text for that week. There's some in the back. There's some on the Connection Center. It's on our website under the resource tab. And so I would encourage you, just because we're not going to have time to adequately hit every single word, for you to still be in those texts, walking through that text during that week. And so this morning, as we walk through chapters 1 to 4, for you to have spent time this past week reading chapters 1 to 4 and walking through that. So this morning's sermon is simply titled The Way In. And so if you are familiar with boxing or mixed martial arts or any of those things, there is this moment before fight, whether it's a week ahead or just the moments ahead, where they pair the fighters up and they weigh them in and they put them next to each other and kind of show you, hey, in this corner, in the blue shorts, from Sacramento, weighing in at 205 pounds with a reach of 30 inches, with a title, at stake, right? 31-0, 14 knockouts, right? You may be familiar with those. And if you look at history and look at matches from the past, there are plenty of those in boxing, in mixed martial arts, and in those things that are very mismatched. And you can kind of look at who's paired up and kind of shake your head going, this isn't going to end well. There's plenty of videos for that as well. Even this week, watch some, kids fighting in boxing tournaments. They're the same weight, but one's like 6'3", the other is like 4'8". But so you have these mixed matches or mismatches in boxing and in fighting. So November 1980, this fight took place. Sugar Ray Leonard versus Roberto Duran. Right, Sugar Ray Leonard comes into this fight with a record of 36-4, 25 knockouts. Roberto Duran comes in with 103 wins, 16 losses, 70 knockouts. They had fought once before, and Roberto Duran had lost. He had won. He had come in 41 consecutive wins, comes into this fight expected to win. And if you watch the video, you see Roberto Duran just gets frustrated, right? And as the fight goes on, Sugar Ray Leonard just begins playing around with him, kind of mocking him, teasing him. And as they make their way into the 8th round, Roberto Duran finally just gets frustrated and utters 2 words to the ref: "No mas." No mas means no more. I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And throws the fight. And Sugar Ray Leonard, who was not expected to win, comes out on top. But at the beginning of the fight, it was no contest, right? Sugar Ray Leonard should not have won that fight. And in the end, Roberto Duran simply just calls the fight, says, I'm done with this. I'm done. And as we walk our way through the book of Exodus, we'll see a little bit of that, especially next week. Chapters 5 to 11, we really see the showdown of powers. As we look at Pharaoh, we'll look at some of that this morning. But I think Moses wrote the book of Exodus. Moses is kind of doing this. He's kind of showing us who's paired up in this. Let's look at Pharaoh. Let's look at his record. Let's look at how he approaches life, how he approaches these slaves. And then let's look at God. And we'll see next week, 5 to 11, the first 9 plagues. And then we'll see in the Passover that Moses in many ways begins to do this very same thing. No mas. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. And yet he doesn't fully relent. He doesn't fully turn and submit. And so in the end, we'll see what it will cost him. A few years ago, there was a book written called The Exodus Mandate. The subtitle is, Moses Reveals How You Can Accomplish the Impossible. And sadly, that's the approach for many authors as they look at the Old Testament. How do we read these books, read these texts, read these stories, and see what really matters? We tend to insert ourselves into these stories, into these these narratives, right? And that's one of the detriments to moralistic preaching. Right, let's read the text. What's the moral of the story? Well, don't live like Pharaoh, live like Moses. Look at him. Look, you can accomplish the impossible. The problem with that is chapter 2. You don't have to go very far into the book of Exodus to realize Moses is a murderer, right? And we'll look at that in a minute. But the goal for us as we work our way through the Bible, Old Testament especially, confusing passages, is not to look at how can we be the hero, right? What do we need to do to accomplish the impossible? I want you to see that's a faulty way of approaching the Bible. It's a faulty way of approaching the Old Testament in particular because it's very confusing. God is the central figure in the Old Testament. God is the central hero in this text for us this morning. That's what we'll see as we work our way through this sermon series. You can see that at the bottom of every slide, right, is a God that saves in chapters 1 to 13. In this Exodus story of leading the people out through the Red Sea, into the desert, into the wilderness. It's God who saves. And then in the desert wanderings, they're not lost. But we tend to hear, man, they were just lost for 40 years. No, they're not lost. God is leading them, purging them, shepherding them. And so is a God who shepherds in chapters 14 to 24. And then lastly, we have all of these chapters 25 to 40, about the building of the tabernacle. Well, how are we now supposed to relate to God and interact with God? Is it on our own terms? Is there something to follow? And so we'll see it is a God who sanctifies and sets the stage for us and how we are supposed to relate to Him. So Exodus is not about how you can look at Moses and then accomplish the impossible. You will waste your time, waste your money on books like that. This is a story about how God has done the impossible and continues to do the impossible. So what I want you to see in these first 4 chapters is that God is always at work for the good of His people and for the glory of His great name. Always. And there are times that you can see that. You know that. As you look at your own life this past week, this past month, this past year, there are times that are crystal clear. I see what God is doing. I've seen what He's been working on in my own heart, my own life, with our family, where He's taken us. And there are times that are just completely frustrating because you feel like God is nowhere. What is God doing? Is He even near? Does He even care? Right? And so whether you can see it or not, whether it's clear or not, visible or not, God is always at work. And it gives us incredible confidence as we work our way into Exodus, a beautiful book. It's an amazing book for us. Exodus is the high point of the Old Testament. Right? We get into the Old Testament, into Exodus, God saving His people, the Passover in chapter 12, the giving of the law in chapter 20, right? The covenant identity of the people moving toward the promised land. These are all themes that matter. These are themes you see all over the New Testament. These are themes that we still pick up on and talk about today. Don Carson says the exodus of God's people out of Egypt is the greatest redemptive event in the Old Testament. So maybe you're wondering maybe you're not wondering, but the word Exodus, the title of this book, is dripping even with the beauty of the gospel in it. Right? So Exodus in today's language or stories or as you're communicating, Exodus tends to mean just a mass migration of people from one place to another. And that is true. But it's taken from 2 Greek words. Ex, which means from or out of, and hados means way or the road. So it's the road out, the journey out, the escape plan. What's profound is in John 14, verse 6, which is a verse that you should have memorized, especially today in today's context of you can believe whatever you want. It doesn't matter. It's not about the object of your faith, just that you do have faith. Jesus would say that's not true. Jesus says in John 14, 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Not a way, the way. And the word way there is hadas. I am your escape plan. I am the only way for you to get to God. I am your Exodus journey. And so by faith in me, I get you to the promised land. I get you to God Himself. So amazing, even in the title of this book, we see the gospel. So 3 things this morning of, again, looking at God. What is God doing? So first, God remembers, and then God reveals, and then lastly, God repurposes. So in chapters 1 and 2, roughly, we'll see that God remembers his promises. So chapter 1, again, is kind of the history. It sets the stage for us. Again, as we're looking at the way in of Pharaoh and God, kind of reveals to us who is Pharaoh, what's been going on, what's happening. And when you get to verse 8, it says, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So Pharaoh does not know Joseph. And I would simply say, as we begin to contrast Pharaoh or this king and who God is, verse 8 says, Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know these Israelites. He doesn't know their story. He doesn't even know why potentially they're even in their land. And yet God does. God does know. So as was kind of read a little bit during the prayer time, so they begin to grow and multiply. Pharaoh doesn't like it, so they begin to mistreat and treat horribly the nation of Israel, living in their borders. So they grew stronger, so because of that, they're oppressed even more. They grow stronger. God continues to show favor as they grow, and their families expand, and it frustrates Pharaoh all the more. But God is near, and God does know in the midst of these horrible moments of slavery and oppression. So verses 10 to 13. So come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. So you can hear even just the adjectives that are used to describe this, just ruthless and these burdens and just this oppression. But God knows. In the midst of slavery, in the midst of oppression, but it moves from there into murder, into death, into verse 16. When you serve as a midwife, it's profound that we don't even know what Pharaoh's name is here. In chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, as Pharaoh is mentioned, Moses doesn't even bother to tell us his name, but he does pay attention to these 2 women's name. They matter enough to get their name here in verse 15, Shiphrah and Puah. When you serve as a midwife and you see these Hebrew women on the birth stool, if a son comes, kill him. And we, as was already read, they disobey that in favor of trusting God, fearing God. But in the midst of murder and death, God knows. Even to the point that we see, again, as I said a minute ago, like Moses isn't our standard. Like, let's follow Moses, be like Moses. Because in chapter 2, in verse 12, he gets there, he's looking out over the people, over the Egyptians, and this slavery that's happening. He sees one of them being beaten. It says in verse 12, he looks this way and that, and seeing that no one was watching, he struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. Right? So in the midst of all of this, of slavery and oppression and death, even Moses' personal sin, God knows. God does know. So you contrast verse 8 of chapter 1, that Pharaoh doesn't know Joseph, and then we get to chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Simply amazing 3 words, and God knew. And the same is true for us this morning. God knows. Right, so 2 amazing words there in 24. He remembered and he knew. Remember here doesn't mean like God was just busy and had forgotten and sees this and hears the groaning and hears these prayers, and finally he says, oh, I wonder what's happening down in Egypt. Remember doesn't mean that. It means he's about to take action on behalf of his people. That's what he means when it says that he remembered. It's a call to action for God. And in verse 25, God knew. To know is to be intimately acquainted with something. It's the word that's used in Genesis 4. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived a son. So used in Psalm 1, verse 6, God knows the way of the righteous. God knows. God is intimately involved with the details of every single one of these lives. God is intimately concerned and intimately acquainted with every detail of your life this morning. See, Moses sees, he looks out and sees the sin that's happening in verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2, and then he responds in sin, murders. But notice how God responds in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 3. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. Listen to the words that are used. I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So God responds very differently than Moses. Moses responds sinfully. God responds with mercy and with grace and in righteousness and holiness. Why? Why would God respond this way? Look at verses 22 and 23 of chapter 4. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. Because if you refuse me and you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So God's heart for and care for and concern for these people that he remembers and knows is because of this special relationship that he has with him as his very son. And so what this reveals, this contrast between Moses and God, reveals two things. One, it's the futility of our own attempts, our own efforts at fixing things without God, without God's power, without God's Spirit. Moses responds in sin, kills him, buries him. Eventually it says the thing was known in verse 14. Surely this thing is known. Of course it is. Right, so it shows the futility of our own efforts without God. And secondly, it shows our desperate need for God. Right, they're crying out for help in verse 23 of chapter 2. During the many days, the king of Egypt died. So this Pharaoh from chapter 1 is now dead, and now there's a new Pharaoh. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. And their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. So God responds because of their heartfelt groaning and crying out to God. God is waiting to respond, waiting to fight for us. It's interesting that groaning and grumbling and complaining are all over the book of Exodus. And yet here, because it's a groaning and a crying out for help, God responds. Alec Motyer, who wrote a commentary on the book of Exodus, says, the greatness of God's love for us as individuals is perhaps most strikingly seen in this, that we can appeal to him simply because we are in need. That's why we pray. Because God hears us, because God answers us, because God is waiting to fight for us. It's one of the great themes of Exodus. We'll see eventually God's command, just be still, and I will fight for you. God answers. But the reality is we are spiritually incapable of saving ourselves, spiritually incapable of freeing ourselves. They're in bondage and in slavery. They cannot do anything about it themselves, and the same is true for us. So no matter what you're facing this morning, big decisions or big news that you've received, whatever you're facing this morning, God knows. God cares. These words that we read a minute ago, God sees and knows and hears, and God has come and to deliver. Like these verbs are still active today from verses 7 and 8 in chapter 3. These still apply to us today. So God cares, God knows, and God has already acted on our behalf to take care of our biggest problem in our lives, the biggest problem that we face as well. Our bondage and our slavery to sin. The reality is many of these people that were in chapter 1 and early chapter 2 have died and moved on. It's their children that are born into this slavery. And the same is true of us. We're born into the slavery of sin. We don't see it here in Exodus 1 and 2 or even chapter 3, but in Acts chapter 7, before Stephen is martyred for his faith, he goes into this long speech about God's faithfulness. And in there, he talks about this text. And he gives us some time markers. So from chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 11 is 40 years. Verse 11 of chapter 2, one day when Moses had grown up, right? He's 40 years old now. 40 years had passed. And from chapter 2, verse 11 to chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. That's 40 years. So it's 80 years of seemingly waiting for God. Where is God? I'm begging God to move and begging God to save, and eventually he does, but now it's my grandchildren that are experiencing salvation. Right? So no matter what you're facing, the timeline may not be what you expect, but God has not forgotten. Right? God is always on time. It may not be our timeline and what we think it should be, and God showing up when we expect him to be there, but God is always on time. So what does that mean for us? So what? What does this text mean for us today, 2019, in Minnesota, in where we're living? What does this mean for me? It means that we can have absolute trust in this God. Absolute dependence that God remembers his promises. He has not forgotten. He has acted. He will continue to act. Secondly, we see as we work our way into chapter 3 that God reveals himself as all-powerful. Verse 2 of chapter 3, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. The truth is, Moses has walked this route many days. Moses isn't lost with this flock of his father-in-law's sheep. He knows this path. He knows this journey. He knows where to turn. He knows where to feed them, knows where to water them. This is routine. And in the midst of routine, he sees a bush burning and yet not consumed. Right? And in our everyday life, we are so prone to miss, in our everyday life, our everyday situations, our everyday surroundings, we tend to miss what God is doing. There's no burning bush in your office. Trust me, if that happens, run. Like, grab a fire extinguisher. That's not how God reveals himself today. And yet, God is working and moving and stirring and active. And because of the mundane and because of the routine, we tend to overlook it. We tend to miss it. But your life is not simply made up of 5 or 6 or 10 big events. I was born, I graduated high school, barely, got married, made my way through college, I got married, or I already said married, had kids, retired, had more kids, right? But we tend to view our life as that, 5 or 6 different peaks on a mountain range. And the reality is that your life is made up of millions and millions of mundane moments. That's life. It's not the mountaintop experiences. It's the day-to-day walk through the valley of your life that consists in you getting up and making breakfast and showering and going to work and loving your spouse and mowing your yard. All of those. Your life is made up of millions of mundane moments. Surprise. You already know that. And in each of those, God is actively working. In every single one of those seemingly mundane moments, God is actively working to show you your need of him. Paul Tripp says, if God doesn't rule your mundane, then he doesn't rule you, because that's where you live. These are the moments that make up our lives. But Moses doesn't walk past. Verse 3. Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. So he sees what he's walked past 1,000,000 times. And finally he says, I'm going to turn aside. I don't want to miss this. He's not looking for God. but yet God meets him. And more than just God. So in verse 2, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him. So the angel here is a messenger. It's a representative that God would send out to speak on behalf of him. But notice the language that's used down into verse 4, into verse 6, all the way through the rest of chapter 3. This isn't just a messenger that's speaking on behalf of God. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside, God called to him. Verse 6, and he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This isn't just a messenger that's sent on behalf of God. This is what, well, there's many books that are written on, what does this mean? What's the angel of the Lord? So I would fall in the camp that would say this is a Christophany. Big word, take notes. So it's an Old Testament manifestation of the pre-incarnate Christ. So Jesus, before he shows up in a manger, appears in the Old Testament in many, many ways. That's the only way that you can adequately describe what's happening here. Because this is an angel, a messenger that's sent on behalf of God and yet says, I am God. I am God. Moses is afraid to look at God. This isn't just an angel, a little kind of fat kid with a harp that shows up. I don't know where Hallmark gets these ideas. This is the pre-incarnate Christ that appears to Moses. There's a handful of times this happens in the Old Testament. Daniel, you remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're put into a fiery furnace. 3 men into the furnace, and it says, behold, I looked, and there's a fourth, one like a son of man, in the furnace with them. It's amazing. This was not God himself. If it was God himself, Moses would have been consumed because of his sin. It is impossible for us to see God and live. But notice that Moses isn't welcome on his own terms either. Verse 5, he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. In other words, this is holy, and Moses, you are not. So I'm going to tell you how you can approach, and it's by taking off your sandals. There needs to be something that you follow in order for you to draw near. And it's the same today. We do not draw near to God on our own terms. God is explicit about, you want to draw near, this is how you do it. And in the New Testament, we see it's through Christ. That's our only way. John 14:6, the only way we get to God is by his Son, by his death for us. So, a couple of ways that God powerfully reveals himself. First of all, I would say in his Son. We see that in verse 2, but we see that all over the Bible. Hebrews 1 and 2, the author of Hebrews says, in many ways, and in times before, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets, but now he has chosen to speak to us by his Son. So God reveals himself by his Son. Secondly, God reveals himself by his promises, or I would say by the promises of his word. So they didn't have an Old Testament that they would run with, right? And so what it was God speaking to them audibly, God communicating to them by his word, and them resting in those very promises. We see this in verse 6 of chapter 3. It says, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This ties us right back to verse 1 of chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. This takes us all the way back into Genesis 50. Right? Who was this Joseph and the promises that God had made? Right? Joseph is sold into slavery, and the book of Genesis ends. You remember this great text, Genesis 50, verse 20. Joseph finally has all of his brothers there. He told them, look, you're going to bow down to me one day. They don't like it, so they throw him in a pit, and eventually sell him into slavery, and Genesis ends. That's how they all end up here in Egypt. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, for the saving of many. Right? And all these promises that God had made, all these covenants that we see with the nation of Israel, that you can trust me and you can take me at my word. We see this eventually in chapter 3, verse 12. Moses said to God, that's 13. He said, but I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you that I've sent you. right? So Moses right now is on Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. And God says, this will be the sign for you to prove that I'm telling the truth, that I've sent you when you've brought the people. So you're going to go from here, you're going to go to Egypt, you're going to lead the people of Egypt back out, and you will serve God on this mountain. So Mount Horeb is Mount Sinai. Moses is the very place that he's going to return to get the law. And God's saying, this is going to be the proof. You're going to end up back here. Verse 17 of chapter 3. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the afflictions of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. I promise you. So God reveals himself by his Son. God reveals himself by his promises. God reveals himself by his name. So the high point in chapter 3, verse 14. Moses is saying, okay, you're going to send me. Who am I supposed to tell them is sending me? God says, great question. God said, I am who I am. He said, say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. So I am, what does that mean? It means God is eternally self-existent. He's not dependent on anything or anyone else. The creator of everything, the sustainer of everything, the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's who's sending you. Right? So I am in Hebrew is YHWH. It's where we get the word Yahweh. It's in the Old Testament. If you're looking there, even in these verses. So in what verse are we in? In verse 15 of chapter 3, you'll notice Lord is all caps. That's the Hebrew way of communicating the covenant name, this I am, the Yahweh. That's how they differentiate that, with all caps. This is why Jesus gets into such hot water with the Pharisees in the New Testament. You read the Gospels, and Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. Right? I am the bread of life. We hear that as the object. Oh, you're bread. The Hebrew would have heard that as him saying, bread, I am. Right? In John 8, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. It's because of this. Jesus is self-identifying himself with God. And that's why they picked up stones to kill him. So he reveals himself through his Son, through his promises, through his name, and lastly, by intervening in human history. Now, we see that even in verse 19 of chapter 3. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I'm going to do what it takes to demonstrate my power and my faithfulness to you and to him by stepping in and with my mighty hand, stretching out my hand to strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. So every aspect of our lives is to be lived in response to God's initiating and intervening grace and revelation of himself. Right, so again, the question, so what? What does that mean? It means that there's nothing in your life that's off limits. No spot of your heart, your life, right? As you look at every aspect of your life, there's no part of your life that's off limits. God demands absolute obedience. But secondly, I think it means we still must approach God on his terms. So lastly, God repurposes us for his glory. So into Exodus 4, God gives Moses all of these powerful signs, and he returns to Egypt. But what God is then communicating through Moses to Egypt and to the Israelites, ultimately to Pharaoh first, is that these slaves who have no value to you, right? You're oppressing them, you're murdering them, they have no value to you. They are mine. And I love them, and I want them. They belong to me. And I'm going to do what it takes to remove them from your control and bring them into my care. I want them ultimately for their service, for their worship, for their glory. Look at verse 23 of chapter 4. I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. So the object there is for them, once they're free, is to serve God. Not as slaves, but as children. That's what verse 22 is all about. Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I love them. I want them to serve me. No longer under your control and authority. They belong to me. But God pursues Moses as well. Not just the Israelites, but God pursues Moses. Again, at the burning bush, God is pursuing Moses. Moses wasn't looking for God. So Moses, this murderer who fled for his life to Midian, tending his father-in-law's sheep, eventually is given this task by God, and his response is, really, me? Right, to the point that it kindles God's anger against him. So a Jew raised by Egyptians, right, this mixed identity. We see that even in chapter 2. He saw the Egyptians beating Hebrew, one of his people. Although he was the daughter of Pharaoh, or he was a son of Pharaoh's daughter, he became her son. Near the end of chapter 2, Moses' wife Zipporah gave birth to a son, called his name Gershom. Why? For he said, I've been a sojourner in a foreign land. So all of these identities of who Moses is, where do I fit? Who am I? Who do I really belong to? Come out in this name, right? Just this wandering nomad, this sojourner. I'm just going to name my son that because that's how I feel. Where do I fit? Right? And yet God chooses him. Listen to verse 8, verse 10, and verse 12 of chapter 3. I have come down to deliver them. God is saying, I've come down to deliver them, the slaves, out of the hands of Egyptians, to bring them up out of the land. Right? And how's he going to do it? Well, verse 10. Come, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Verse 12. But I will be with you. It's amazing. God says, I'm going to free them. I'm coming down and I'm going to do this. And the way I'm going to do it is you. But Moses, I'm going to be with you. So all of these identities that Moses is wrestling with of who am I? Where do I fit? Do I really matter to God? How can God use me? What about my sin? What about my past? Those are the same questions that you and I wrestle with. Why me? Does God really care? Does God really matter? Do I really matter ultimately to God? How can God use me? What about my past? What about my sin? What about my shortcomings? That's exactly the point. Because then the glory goes where it belongs. The truth is that we make better conduits for glory than we do containers for it. Right? A pipe is designed to move something from point A to point B. Right? A cup is just, let me just fill this and let it sit there. And we make a better pipe for glory than we do a cup. Because you hold on to glory for yourself too long, it'll kill you. It'll destroy you. That's why you see people running Fortune 500 companies, made it to the top, going, this is all worthless. I made it to the top and nothing matters. Why? Because you held glory for yourself. The purpose of your life is to make God look glorious, not hold the glory for yourself. James Denney said, no man can at once give the impressions that he himself is clever and that Jesus Christ is mighty to save. Right? You cannot say, man, look how awesome I am. And by the way, look, yeah, God's pretty awesome too. It doesn't work that way. It is your glory or his. It cannot be both. There are less than 20 known Leonardo da Vinci paintings in existence. The one that's up on the screen is called Salvator Mundi, means Savior of the world. You see this orb that Jesus is holding. It was auctioned November of 2017 it's the most expensive painting ever sold at auction, $450 million. And after the auction, it disappeared. Nobody knows where it is. They think it's on a boat outside of Abu Dhabi while they're finishing a museum for it to go into. But you know what nobody's concerned with? Nobody's scratching their head going, man, I wonder what kind of brushes he used. Right? Maybe an art historian, but nobody's concerned with the brush. Why? Because look at the painting. Look at the masterpiece. Look at the master and what he created. It's not about the object. And we, as brushes, tend to think it's about us. Look how awesome of a brush I am. No, look at the painting. God uses insignificant objects for his glory. Look at verse 2 of chapter 4. The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "It's a staff. Take this staff, go to the Israelites, go ultimately to Pharaoh. It's going to become a snake." Verse 12 of chapter 4. "Now therefore go. I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." "Oh Lord, please send somebody else." Verse 21. The Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I've put in your power, but I will harden his heart." Right, so over and over and over, not just not just Moses, but all of these seemingly insignificant things God repurposes for his glory. Right? This staff becoming a snake, the mouth, the miracles, all of it is for God's glory. And there are two responses that come, and these are the same today. We see the first in verse 21 there, hardening. His heart is going to be hard. That's a response that comes from beholding God still today. Or the other one is seen down in verse 31. The people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. Those are the same responses today. Those same responses you get to choose from this morning. Right? To turn away from God or to treasure God. To harden your heart or to respond in belief and worship. One of the questions, and we'll wrap up with this. One of the questions I want you to ask every time you read, not just the Old Testament, primarily the Old Testament, because it's a little more tricky. Right? If you're reading the Gospels, it's easy to see where Jesus is. But in the Old Testament, a question I want you to wrestle with is, how does this passage point me to God's work of redemption in Christ? If this is the high point in the Old Testament, and this is the high point in the Jewish mind of redemption, and the cross is the high point in the New Testament of God's work of redemption for us, then we have to ask, how do they fit together? Verses 22 and 23 of chapter 4, this beauty of the identity of Israel being called the son. "Let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse me, I will kill your firstborn son," which God ultimately does. Right, when we get to Matthew 2, there's another story similar to the opening chapters of Exodus. Right, the Magi show up. "Hey, where's the king?" "I'm the king." No, the real king, the king born, the child born king of the Jews. Right, and in that moment, Joseph is warned to take his family and flee to Egypt. And in that moment, Herod kills all of the kids, eventually dies, and Joseph and Mary and Jesus come out of Egypt, and the declaration is made, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Ultimately, to come and to bear the weight of sin and to die for humanity. So the opening chapters of Exodus point us to that reality of, out of Egypt I have called my true son, who will come and lay his life down for all of God's people. But I want you to see that God is always at work. And there are other ways we get to the cross in the opening chapters of Exodus, but that's one. But I want you to see God is always at work for your good. Always. But ultimately for his glory, even when you don't see it. So I'm going to invite the worship team to come for a closing song and invite you to just let God speak to you and for you to respond in obedience in these moments. Let's pray, and as the worship team comes.